In the dying weeks of August 1793, while the Susquehanna Valley still smelled of dust and dry corn, and most families in Brindle Hollow were busy with the ordinary work of late summer, thrashing rye, salting pork, drawing the last harvest from gardens going brown at the edges, Tamsin Holloway was doing something else entirely. She was boiling pine tar in a black iron kettle behind her cabin from sunup to sundown. The smoke rose thick and resinous over the trees, dark and oily, drifting across the hollow until even the wind seemed to carry the smell of burning pine. With a wide horsehair brush and a wooden paddle, she began coating the outer walls of her cabin, board by board, every plank, every seam, every crack between the chinking. Then she moved inside and began doing the same to the door frames, the window sills, the threshold beneath every door. Nothing about it looked sensible. The work blackened her hands to the wrist. Her dress, once dyed indigo, turned the color of soot and stuck stiffly to her arms in the heat. Inside the cabin were her husband Eben, weakening from a slow summer fever neighbors had begun to whisper about, and their two children, Rowan, age 6, and little Susanna, just past her second birthday. Travelers along the wagon road slowed their horses to stare. Some made the sign of the cross when they passed. Others laughed openly and said the heat of August had cracked her senses. A few muttered darker things. The Methodist preacher's wife was overheard at the meeting house saying Tamsin Holloway had begun keeping company with the old ways, that no honest woman blackened her home like a coffin. They could see Tamsin was not painting her cabin. She was sealing it. And the way she worked, slow, methodical, as if measuring something invisible, made the watchers uneasy in a way they could not name. To them, it did not look like housekeeping. It looked like a woman quietly drawing a circle against something she alone could see. What had she heard moving down the river road that the rest of Brindle Hollow had not? What did the pine tar know that no preacher and no physician seemed willing to learn? Would the dark walls of her home become a fortress for her family, or the very mark that doomed them? Subscribe to follow this strange and quiet stand against an enemy no one could see. One hot afternoon in the first week of September, a wagon rolled to a stop at the edge of the Holloway yard. The driver was Asaph Pettigrew, a county physician of 40 years standing, a thin man with steel-rimmed spectacles and a leather satchel worn pale at the corners. He had been called north to look in on the Holloway household after rumors reached town about Eben's worsening fever. He stopped 20 paces from the porch and stared at the cabin. The black walls glistened in the sun like wet pitch. The smell hit him before he had taken 3 more steps, sharp, medicinal, almost suffocating in the late summer heat. His expression did not change to amusement. It darkened. He climbed down stiffly from the wagon and approached, holding a folded handkerchief against his mouth. Tamsin watched him from the porch, brush still in her hand, a streak of black drying across her cheek. "Mrs. Holloway," Pettigrew said carefully, "do you know what fever is moving along the river?" She nodded once. "It has emptied Wrightsville. It has reached Columbia. By the count I had this morning, 11 households below the ferry have been struck and 4 are already in the ground." He glanced again at the tarred walls. "And this is your answer." Tamsin did not speak. "Tar will not stop sickness," he said more quietly now. "It will only mark your house. People are frightened, Mrs. Holloway. Frightened people do not need a reason to choose someone. They only need a sign." His eyes moved past her toward the dim window, where Rowan's small face had just appeared. "You are painting a target on your own door." The wind shifted, and the pine smoke rolled across the yard between them. Tamsin lowered the brush slowly to her side. She looked once toward the river road, then back at the physician. "Then let them choose me," she said, "before the fever does." Pettigrew left without entering the cabin. The wagon creaked away through the late afternoon dust, and Tamsin returned, without a word, to her kettle. That evening, after the physician's wagon had disappeared beyond the ridge, Tamsin sat on the porch step with her blackened hands resting open in her lap. The pine smoke had thinned to a pale haze drifting through the orchard, and the cicadas had begun their dry evening song. Inside the cabin she could hear Eben coughing, a low, wet sound that had been growing slower and heavier for almost a week now. Not the killing cough yet, not the one she feared, but something settling into him just the same. Rowan came out and sat beside her without speaking. He was small for 6, all elbows and knees, with his father's pale hair and his mother's watchful gray eyes. For a long moment he simply looked at her hands, then at the dark walls of the cabin behind them, then back at her hands again. "Mama," he finally asked, "why does the doctor look at us that way?" Tamsin did not answer right away. She watched a hawk circling slow above the cornfield across the road, dropping lower in the gold evening light. Then she said very quietly, "Because he does not yet know what I know, Rowan." And men who do not know a thing are often angry at the people who do. She drew him against her shoulder, and they sat there together, breathing the pine resin in the cooling air, while the first stars came out over the river valley. That night, after the children were asleep on their straw ticks and Eben lay restless beneath a damp cloth, Tamsin sat at the kitchen table with a single tallow candle burning between her hands. From beneath a loose board near the hearth she drew out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were 3 things: a folded letter from her sister in Philadelphia dated late July, a printed broadsheet from the city's College of Physicians, and a small leather-bound book of recipes and notes that had belonged to her mother and her mother's mother before her. The letter from her sister was the thing she returned to first. She had read it so many times the creases were beginning to soften like cloth. Myra had written from a city falling to pieces, whole streets emptied, carts moving by torchlight through the alleys, doors marked with chalk crosses, a yellow fever the doctors could not name and could not stop. And in the middle of it all, one detail her sister had repeated twice in the same letter, as if she herself had not quite believed it. The houses where they boiled tar in the streets, Myra had written. The houses where pine smoke hung thick through the alleys. The sickness seemed to pass them by. Not always. Not perfectly. But often enough that men in long coats had begun standing at the corners with smoking braziers, and the broadsheet from the College of Physicians, printed only the week before, was now openly recommending the burning of tar, gunpowder, and vinegar in the affected wards. Tamsin did not believe the smoke itself was the answer. She had read the broadsheet too carefully for that. But there was something else, something her grandmother had written into the small leather book 60 years earlier, when fevers had moved through the Pennsylvania backcountry during a wet autumn she had never lived to see end. The note was brief. It said only this: "Where the air is bitter with resin, the biting things will not come." The biting things. Her grandmother had been a practical woman, not given to riddles, and Tamsin had read those 4 words 100 times before she understood what they meant. Mosquitoes. Gnats. The clouds of small bodies that rose from the river marshes every August in this part of the valley, and that, she had begun to suspect for reasons she could not yet prove, arrived in the hollows just before the fevers did. She did not have the words a physician would use 100 years later. She had no theory of contagion she could name. What she had was her sister's letter, her grandmother's note, the broadsheet from the city, and her own quiet observation that in every summer Eben had taken sick. The swamp behind the lower field had been thick with biting things for weeks before. She closed the book carefully, blew out the candle, and sat in the dark a long time, listening to her husband breathe. By the 2nd week of September, the fever had crossed the river. The first death in Brindle Hollow came on a Tuesday morning. An old widower named Caleb Stryker, who lived alone in a cabin near the ferry landing. He had been well on Saturday, feverish by Sunday evening, yellow at the eyes by Monday, and gone before the sun rose on Tuesday. The men who carried him to the burying ground worked fast and spoke little. By Wednesday 2 more households along the lower road had taken to their beds, and by Friday the meeting house bell rang for the 2nd time that week. Tamsin heard the bell from her kitchen and set down the wooden spoon she had been stirring with. She walked to the window and stood there a long time, looking out toward the road where the dust hung pale in the morning light. Then she turned and went back to the hearth, and she did not stop working again until well after dark. She had begun a 2nd round of tar by then, thinner this time, mixed with turpentine drawn from the same pines, and she was painting it across the inside of every window frame, every shutter, every gap in the chinking she could find. She crushed dried tansy and pennyroyal from her garden and laid them in shallow tin dishes on the sills. She hung bundles of sweet fern from the rafters above the children's beds. The cabin began to smell like a strange church, resin and herb and bitter green all at once, but the biting things, which only days before had clouded the air every evening near the back door, had begun to keep their distance. She noticed it first on a Thursday at dusk. She had carried a bucket of well water across the yard and stood for a moment by the kitchen step, expecting the familiar whine in her ears, the small, soft landings on the back of her neck. Nothing came. She turned slowly, looking at the tarred walls in the long red light, and felt something settle in her chest that was not quite hope, but was steady, and it was the first steady thing she had felt in a month. That same evening, the trouble began. It was the Hatch boy who first came to the fence. He was perhaps 13, lank and freckled, the second son of a family that kept a small dairy half a mile down the road. He stood at the edge of the Holloway yard with his hands pushed deep in his pockets and stared at the black cabin for a long time before he spoke. "My ma says you've been talking to the devil," he said finally. He did not say it with malice. He said it the way a boy repeats something he has overheard at a table and does not quite understand. Tamsin straightened from the row of beans she had been pulling and wiped her hands on her apron. She studied the boy a moment. "What is your name?" she asked. "Micah. Micah, do I look like a woman who has been talking to the devil?" The boy considered her carefully. The truth was she looked tired, blackened to the elbows, with a smudge of pine tar drying along her jaw and her hair coming loose from its pins. She looked, in fact, exactly the way the old stories said such a woman might look. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I don't know, ma'am," he said honestly. She nodded as if this was the right answer. Then she crossed to the fence, picked one of the early apples from the basket she had set there in the morning, and held it out to him through the rails. "You tell your mother," she said gently, "that I am boiling pine, the same as the doctors in Philadelphia are telling their people to do. You tell her I have a sick husband and 2 small children, and I am doing what a woman does. You tell her if she would like to come and see the kettle herself, she is welcome at my fire." The boy took the apple. He looked at her another long moment, then turned and walked back down the road. She watched him go until he was out of sight beyond the orchard, and then she stood at the fence a little longer because she knew, the way a woman knows weather, that the boy was only the first. The second visitor came 2 days later, and she did not come to the fence. It was Prudence Hatch herself, the boy's mother, walking up the wagon road in the heat of the afternoon with another woman beside her, Goodwife Eller, whose husband kept the small mill at the lower bend of the creek. They came without baskets, without greetings, without the small courtesies that women of the Hollow had always extended to one another even in disagreement. They came with their bonnets pulled forward and their mouths set in straight pale lines, and Tamsin saw them from the kitchen window before they had reached the gate. She set the bread she had been kneading onto a board, covered it with a clean cloth, and washed her hands carefully in the basin by the door. She did not hurry. By the time the 2 women had reached the porch, she was standing on the step waiting for them with her hands folded against her apron. "Prudence," she said, "Beulah, will you come inside? The kettle is on." Neither woman moved. Prudence Hatch looked past her at the dark walls of the cabin, then at the bundles of sweet fern visible through the open door, then back at Tamsin's face. Her mouth tightened further. "We will not come inside, Tamsin Holloway," she said. "We have come to ask you a question." "Then ask it. Why has no one in this house taken sick?" The silence that followed was longer than it needed to be. Tamsin heard the cicadas in the orchard, the distant lowing of a cow somewhere down the road, the soft creak of the porch board beneath her own foot. She kept her voice level when she answered. "Eben is sick, Prudence. He has been sick for 3 weeks. You know that? Eben has the slow fever. He has had it before. He will have it again. I'm not speaking of Eben." Prudence's eyes were hard now, not cruel, but frightened in a way that had hardened into something worse than cruelty. "Caleb Stryker is in the ground. The Tully woman is in the ground as of yesterday morning. The Borden twins are not expected to live the week. My own sister's husband has been taken to his bed and cannot keep water down. And your children run barefoot in your yard, Tamsin. Your children laugh. Tamsin felt something cold move through the center of her chest. She had known this was coming. She had known it from the moment Micah Hatch had taken the apple at the fence. But knowing a thing and standing in front of it were not the same. I am sorry for your sister's husband, she said carefully. I am sorry for the Bordens. I have sent broth to the Tully house twice this week, and the basket was returned the second time without a word. I am doing what I can do, Prudence. What you can do. Beulah Eller spoke for the first time. Her voice was thinner than Prudence's, but tighter, with something brittle running through it. What you are doing, Tamsin, is painting your walls the color of tar pits and burning your kettle from dawn to dusk and hanging weeds from your ceiling. What you are doing is not what women in this hollow do. It is what women in Philadelphia are doing. We are not in Philadelphia. No, Tamsin said quietly. We are not, but the fever does not seem to know the difference. Prudence took one step closer to the porch. She did not raise her voice. That was the part Tamsin would remember afterward, that she did not need to. You will take down the herbs, Prudence said. You will scrub the tar from the walls. You will come to meeting on Sunday, and you will sit in the pew where everyone can see you, and you will pray with the rest of us for the mercy of God upon this hollow. Because if you do not, Tamsin, I cannot answer for what the men will say by the end of next week. Do you understand me? Tamsin looked at her a long moment. Then she looked past her down the road, where the dust still hung in the September light. I understand you, Prudence, she said. But she did not say she would do it. The two women left without another word. Tamsin watched them down the road until they were small dark shapes against the pale dust, and then she sat down on the porch step because her knees would not quite hold her any longer. She sat there a long time, listening to the kettle hiss faintly behind the cabin and the distant rasp of crickets coming up from the creek bottom. When she finally rose, she did not scrub the walls. She did not take down the herbs. She walked instead to the woodshed, opened the heavy door, and counted the pine knots she had been splitting and stacking since August. Then she walked to the spring house and counted the crocks of butter, the wheels of cheese wrapped in damp linen, the jars of preserved peaches and pickled beans she had been laying down since July. Then she walked to the smokehouse and counted the hams. She realized, taking inventory the way a woman takes inventory before a siege. That evening she sat at the table with Eben propped against pillows in his chair by the hearth. He was weaker than he had been a week ago, and the yellow had begun to show faintly at the corners of his eyes, though the fever itself had not climbed the way Caleb Stryker's had. She did not know yet whether this was mercy or only delay. She told him what Prudence Hatch had said. She told him plainly, without softening it, because Eben had married a woman who did not soften things and he had never asked her to start. He listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he reached across the table and took her blackened hand in his thin one. Tamsin, he said, do you remember the winter your father died? She nodded. Do you remember what your mother said to you the night before the burial? She remembered. Her mother had said, a woman who knows a thing and pretends she does not in order to keep the peace of fools will answer for it twice, once to God and once to her own children. Tamsin had been 14 years old. She had not understood it then. She understood it now. I am not taking down the herbs, Eben, she said. I did not ask you to. They will come back. Prudence will come back, and she will bring more of them, and it will not be women next time. I know. Are you afraid? He smiled faintly. It was the first real smile she had seen on him in 2 weeks. Tamsin, he said, I am dying slowly of a thing nobody can name. I have not been afraid of much for some while now. He squeezed her hand once and let it go. But the children, Tamsin, the children frighten me. She did not answer that. There was no answer to give. The next morning was a Sunday, and Tamsin Holloway did something the Hollow had not seen her do in 6 years of Sundays. She got the children up early. She washed their faces and braided Susanna's fine pale hair and put Rowan in his good shirt. She dressed herself in the indigo gown she had not been able to wear since the tar work began, because the indigo had been ruined, but she had a second one folded in the chest, plainer, gray, that her mother had given her at her wedding. She put it on. She pinned her hair. She scrubbed her hands with lye soap and sand until the worst of the black was gone from the creases of her knuckles, though her fingernails would not come clean and she stopped trying. Then she walked her children down the road to the meeting house. She walked slowly, holding Susanna on her hip and Rowan by the hand, and she felt every eye in the hollow on her before she had gone 100 yards. Men stopped on their porches. Women paused at their gates. A small boy ran across a field shouting something Tamsin could not hear, and a woman called him sharply back. Tamsin did not turn her head. She walked the way a woman walks who has decided that if she is to be looked at, she will be looked at upright, with her children clean and her back straight, and not hiding behind her own door. She reached the meeting house steps just as the second bell rang. The meeting house went quiet when she stepped inside. Not all at once, the way a room goes quiet when a stranger enters, but in slow, uneven patches, the way a pond goes still when something heavy has been dropped into it from a distance. The conversation near the door died first, then the murmuring among the women in the front pews, then the low talk of the older men near the stove, which had not been lit yet but stood in the center of the room like a small black altar. By the time Tamsin had walked Susanna and Rowan to a pew near the back, the only sound left was the creak of the floor beneath her own shoes. She sat down. She arranged Susanna on her lap. She drew Rowan close against her side. She folded her hands in her gray skirt and she looked straight ahead at the pulpit, and she did not turn her head once to see who was watching her. The Reverend Obadiah Sill was a thin man with a long jaw and a habit of clearing his throat before any sentence that mattered. He cleared it now. Tamsin heard the small, dry sound from the front of the room and understood, before he had spoken a word, that he had prepared something. She had known he would. A preacher does not stand in his own pulpit during a season of fevers and let a moment like this pass unused. He began with Scripture. He read from the book of Numbers, the passage about the plague that came upon the camp of Israel, and how Aaron stood between the dead and the living with a censer of incense in his hands, and the plague was stayed. He read it slowly, with weight on certain words, between the dead and the living. He let those words hang in the air. Then he closed the heavy book and looked out at the meeting house, and his eyes moved across the pews until they found Tamsin at the back, and they rested there. "Brothers and sisters," he said, "we are in a season of trial." He spoke for some time. He spoke of the dead, naming each one carefully: Caleb Stryker, Hannah Tully, the elder Borden twin who had gone the night before, 3 others Tamsin had not yet heard about. He spoke of the duty of the living to walk humbly, to confess plainly, to put away strange practices and old wives' remedies and the prideful belief that any one household might purchase its own deliverance through cleverness rather than prayer. He did not say her name. He did not need to. Every face in the meeting house had already turned, or had carefully refused to turn, in the direction of the back pew. Tamsin listened. She did not lower her eyes. She did not lift her chin in defiance either. She simply listened, the way a woman listens to whether she cannot change, and she held her children against her and she waited for him to finish. When the sermon ended, the hymn was sung poorly. People's voices were thin and distracted. Tamsin sang with them in a clear, low voice that she did not raise but did not hide either, and Rowan, who knew the hymn, sang along in his small, reedy way, and Susanna fell asleep against her shoulder before the second verse. After the benediction, no one spoke to her. The pews emptied around her and the families moved out into the yard, and Tamsin waited until the meeting house was nearly empty before she rose and carried Susanna toward the door. Rowan walked close against her skirt. On the steps outside, Asaph Pettigrew was waiting. The physician stood off to one side, leaning on his walking stick, watching the families disperse along the road. He did not approach her until the others had moved off. Then he came across the dusty yard with the slow, careful steps of an old man who had not slept well, and he stopped in front of her, and he studied her face for a long moment before he spoke. "Mrs. Holloway," he said quietly, "I have been to 7 houses this week. Will you walk with me a little way down the road? There is something I would like to ask you, and there is something I think I would like to tell you." Tamsin shifted Susanna on her hip. She looked at him a long moment. Then she nodded and they walked. They walked slowly along the road that led away from the meeting house, past the burying ground where the earth had been turned twice that week, past the low stone wall where the wild grape was beginning to redden at the edges. Rowan walked close against her skirt and said nothing. Susanna slept on her shoulder, warm and heavy, her small fist curled against Tamsin's collar. Pettigrew did not speak until the meeting house was out of sight behind the bend. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Holloway," he said. Tamsin kept walking. "What for?" "For the manner in which I spoke to you at your gate. I have been thinking about it for 2 weeks." He shifted his walking stick to his other hand. "I told you that tar would not stop sickness. I told you that you were painting a target on your door. I have been to 7 houses this week, Mrs. Holloway, and in 3 of them I have watched children die in their mother's arms, and in the other 4 I have watched the fever take hold, and I have not been able to do one useful thing about it. Not one." His voice did not break, but it thinned, the way an old man's voice thins when he has carried something too long. "And I have begun to wonder whether the woman I lectured at her own gate may have understood something I did not." Tamsin walked on. She did not answer right away. "I am not certain I understand it myself, Dr. Pettigrew," she said finally. "I have a letter from my sister in Philadelphia. I have a broadsheet from the College of Physicians. I have a note my grandmother wrote in a recipe book in 1731. I have what I have seen in my own yard. I do not have a theory, I have a habit." "What have you seen in your yard?" She hesitated. Then she told him. She told him about the biting things that rose every August from the swamp behind the lower field, and how every summer Eben took to his bed not long after they came, and how this year, since the tar had gone up and the herbs had gone out and the smoke had begun drifting through the cabin, she had not seen one of them inside her walls. She told him about her grandmother's note. "Where the air is bitter with resin, the biting things will not come." She told him she did not know if the biting things were the cause of anything at all. She only knew that they had always come before the fever, and this year in her house they had not come. Pettigrew walked a long time without speaking. He was looking at the dust at his feet. Tamsin could not read his face. "In Philadelphia," he said finally, "Dr. Rush is bleeding patients twice a day and purging them with calomel until their gums blacken. He is killing them, Mrs. Holloway. I have known Benjamin Rush 20 years, and I will say it on his own doorstep if I am asked. He is killing them, and he is a great man, and he believes with his whole heart that he is saving them. That is the state of medicine in the year 1793. He stopped walking. He turned to face her. "And here is a woman in Brindle Hollow who has read a broadsheet, a letter, and her grandmother's recipe book, and who has noticed something in her own dooryard, and whose family is the only family on this stretch of the river that has not buried someone this month. I do not know what to do with that, Mrs. Holloway, but I am no longer willing to pretend I do not see it." Tamsin looked at him a long moment. Susanna stirred against her shoulder and settled again. "What did you want to ask me?" she said. "I wanted to ask whether you would let me bring a kettle to the Borden house, and to the Eller house when the time comes, and to my own because my wife is 61 years old and the fever has not yet reached our lane, but it will." His voice was very quiet now. "I wanted to ask whether you would teach me what you have been doing. I do not say it will save them. I say only that what I have been doing is not saving them either." Tamsin looked down the road toward home. "Yes," she said, "I will teach you." They began the next morning. Pettigrew arrived at the Holloway cabin a little after sunrise with his wagon and an empty iron kettle in the bed. He had brought a sack of pine knots from his own woodlot and a small leather notebook with a stub of pencil tied to it by a length of string. He climbed down stiffly, as he always did now, and stood for a moment looking at the dark walls of the cabin in the morning light. Then he came up the porch step and took off his hat. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I am at your instruction." Tamsin did not smile, but something in her face eased. She had not slept well. She did not expect to sleep well for some weeks yet. But there was a man on her porch with a notebook in his hand who had come to learn rather than to lecture, and that was a thing she had not thought to see in her lifetime. She took him behind the cabin and showed him the kettle. She showed him how she rendered the pine, slow heat first, never a roaring fire, the difference between the thin tar that worked best on the inside of window frames and the heavier coat that went on the outer walls. She showed him the tin dishes of crushed tansy and pennyroyal on the sills, and explained that her grandmother had written that the biting things hated the smell of tansy more than almost anything else that grew in a kitchen garden. She showed him the bundles of sweet fern hanging from the rafters, and the small clay pots of vinegar she kept set out near the doors, because the broadsheet from the College of Physicians had recommended vinegar and she had decided that doing both could not hurt. Pettigrew wrote it all down. He asked careful questions. He did not interrupt her and he did not correct her, and when she said, "I do not know why this works, I only know what I have seen," he wrote that down too. By midday they had loaded the wagon. By afternoon they were at the Borden house. The Borden cabin sat back from the road in a low place near a slow bend of the creek, and Tamsin understood, the moment the wagon came down the lane, why the family had been struck so hard. The air over the creek bottom was heavy and still. Cattails grew thick in the marsh just beyond the dooryard. She could hear the whine of the biting things before she had climbed down from the wagon. The elder Borden twin was already in the ground. The younger lay in the back room, breathing in a way Tamsin did not like to hear. The mother, Hester Borden, met them at the door with her hair undone and her sleeves pushed past her elbows, and when she saw Tamsin standing behind the physician she went very still. "I will not have her in this house," Hester said. Pettigrew did not argue. He simply set down the kettle he had been carrying and said, "Hester, Sarah is dying. Tamsin has not lost a child. I am asking you to let us try." Hester Borden looked past him at Tamsin. Her face was the face of a woman who had been awake for 4 days. Tamsin had seen that face in her own mirror twice in her life, and she knew that there was no arguing with it, only waiting. She waited. After a long moment, Hester stepped aside. They built the fire in the dooryard, not in the hearth. Tamsin had decided on the way over that the cabin air was too thick already, that what the Borden house needed first was smoke moving through the open windows, not more weight added to a room that was already heavy with sickness. She set the kettle going. She sent Pettigrew to cut sweet fern from the edge of the wood. She went into the back room herself, with Hester following close behind, and she sat down on a stool beside the child's bed, and she did not touch her because Hester had not yet given her leave to, but she looked at her a long time. Sarah Borden was 9 years old. Her hair was dark and damp against the pillow. Her breath came in small, uneven pulls. Tamsin looked up at the mother. "May I open the window, Hester?" she asked. Hester Borden, after a moment, nodded. Sarah Borden did not die that night. She did not die the next night either. By the third morning, her breathing had eased enough that Hester slept for 4 hours straight on the floor beside the bed, and when she woke, Tamsin was still there, sitting on the stool by the window with a cloth in her hand and the smell of pine smoke drifting in through the open shutter. Whether the smoke had saved the child, or the open window, or the broth Tamsin had carried in a covered crock from her own kitchen, or some quiet turning in the sickness itself that no one in 1793 had the words to name, Tamsin could not have said. Pettigrew, when he came back that afternoon with fresh tar in his wagon, looked at the sleeping girl a long time and wrote 3 lines in his notebook, and did not speak at all on the ride home. The story moved through the hollow the way stories do. Not all at once. Not cleanly. By the end of the week, Hester Borden had walked to the Eller house herself, hair still undone, sleeves still pushed past her elbows, and told Beulah Eller plainly that if she did not let Tamsin Holloway through her door before the fever reached her children, she would answer for it to God and to Hester both. By the end of the week after that, there were 3 kettles burning in Brindle Hollow, and a 4th at the Pettigrew place a mile up the road, and the smell of pine resin had begun to drift along the wagon road the way wood smoke drifts in November. Not everyone came. Prudence Hatch did not come. The Reverend Sill did not come. There were houses in the hollow where the shutters stayed closed and the kettles stayed cold, and the families inside prayed in the way they had always prayed. And some of those families lost no one, and some of them lost everyone, and Tamsin never spoke a word against any of them, then or after. She had decided, walking home from the Borden house that first morning, that she would teach any woman who asked and she would not chase any woman who did not, because a woman who is chased to a thing does not keep it, and a woman who comes to it on her own feet does. Eben lived. The slow fever in him did not break so much as it loosened, gradually, through the cool weeks of late September and into October, and by the time the first frost came down over the river valley, he was strong enough to sit on the porch in the afternoons and watch Rowan split kindling in the yard. He was never quite the man he had been before. His breath would catch on cold mornings for the rest of his life. But he lived, and he saw his daughter walk, and he saw the second daughter Tamsin carried through that winter come into the world the following May, a small dark-haired girl they named Myra after the sister in Philadelphia who had written the letter that started everything. The fever left Brindle Hollow in the second week of October, when the nights turned cold enough that the biting things rose no more from the swamp behind the lower field. By then the Hollow had buried 14 of its own. The Holloway cabin had buried none. Asa Pettigrew kept his notebook. He kept it for the rest of his practice, which lasted another 11 years, and when he died in the spring of 1804 his widow gave the notebook to Tamsin, because Pettigrew had written in the front of it, in his careful spidery hand, "This belongs in the end to Mrs. Holloway of Brindle Hollow, who taught me more in one September than the College of Physicians taught me in 40 years." Tamsin kept it in the chest at the foot of her bed, beside her grandmother's recipe book and her sister's letter, and when her daughters were old enough she read it aloud to them, and they read it aloud to theirs. The dark walls of the cabin faded over the years. The tar weathered and cracked and was painted over, eventually, with a plain whitewash, because the danger had passed and Tamsin had never tarred her walls for the look of the thing. But the orchard she planted along the southern fence the following spring, a slow, deliberate line of young pines set against the prevailing wind from the swamp, stood for 90 years. The pines along the southern fence grew slowly. Tamsin tended them the way she tended everything she meant to last, without hurry, without sentiment, with the steady hand of a woman who had learned in one September that the work which saves a family is rarely the work that looks like saving. She thinned the weaker saplings in the second year. She mulched the roots with crushed bark in the third. By the time her daughter Myra was old enough to walk the fence line on her own small legs, the pines were taller than the child, and the air beneath them, even in the heat of August, carried that faint, clean bitterness of resin that Tamsin's grandmother had written about in a recipe book 70 years before. The biting things never came back to the Holloway yard the way they had come in 1793. Whether that was the pines, or the tansy beds Tamsin kept renewing every spring along the kitchen wall, or simply the slow draining of the lower swamp as the hollow was farmed harder through the new century, no one could say with certainty. Tamsin herself, when she was asked, said only that she did not know, and that not knowing a thing was not the same as refusing to do it. She lived a long time. She buried Eben in 1818, on a cold March morning when the river was still running ice, and she lived another 19 years after that, in the same cabin, with Myra and Myra's husband and their children moving through the rooms around her. She grew thin and white-haired and very quiet in her last years, but her hands, which had been black to the wrist in the September of the fever, stayed strong almost to the end, and she was kneading bread on a table in her own kitchen the morning of the day she died. Rowan became a country doctor. He studied first with Asa Pettigrew, and then, when Pettigrew died, with a physician in Lancaster, and he carried his grandfather's notebook and his mother's quiet habits into a practice that stretched along the Susquehanna for 40 years. He was not a great man. He did not make discoveries. He bled fewer patients than most of his contemporaries, and he opened more windows, and the families along his stretch of the river noticed, over time, that the children in his care more often than not lived to grow up. He never quite understood why. Neither did anyone else. The understanding would not arrive for another 100 years, when men in laboratories far from Brindle Hollow would identify the small biting things that rose from swamps in August and would give them, at last, the name they had been waiting all that time to be given. By then, the Holloway cabin was gone. It had burned in the winter of 1889, in a chimney fire that took the roof before the neighbors could reach it, and the family that lived there at the time, descendants of Myra's youngest son, had built a frame farmhouse on the same foundation the following summer. But the pines along the southern fence were still standing. They were enormous by then, dark and shaggy and full of crows, and travelers along what had become the main road through the valley sometimes slowed their carriages to look at them, because there were no other trees quite like them in that part of the county, and no one was entirely sure who had planted them or why. The notebook Asa Pettigrew gave Tamsin still exists. It is in a small county museum now, in a glass case beside a tin dish that once held crushed tansy, and a fragment of a printed broadsheet from the College of Physicians dated August of 1793, and a folded letter in faded brown ink that begins, "Dearest Tamsin, the city is not what it was a month ago." Tamsin Holloway never called herself wise. She never called herself a healer. When her grandchildren asked her, late in her life, how she had known what to do, she would shake her head and say that she had not known, that she had only listened to her sister, to her grandmother, to the broadsheet, to the silence of her own dooryard in the evenings when the biting things did not come. She would say that listening was not the same as knowing. She would say it was only the beginning of it. And then, almost always, she would go back to her bread.